Small government is beautiful. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. There clearly is biblical evidence for government and for taxes, but there's not clear guidance for what size of government and what rate of taxes. The word economics doesn't appear in the Old or New Testament, but the word economics comes from a Greek term that means management of a household. Well, the Bible does say a lot about the management of households. And so your individual household, the organization where you work, that's called microeconomics. The nation in which you live, that's called macroeconomics. The Bible does say a lot about those things, but it doesn't give specific numbers. And so this is why we as Christian economists have to interpret, what did the Old Testament mean? What does the New Testament mean? What did Jesus intend? And so we're seeking today for some guidance on what size government should be. There is no perfect biblical size. Yes, there should be countries. Yes, there should be taxes. The size is not indicated exactly. But I stood in front of my classroom yesterday and did a small demonstration, which I've done many times. Folded my arms over my chest, and I said, the intersection of Christianity and economics is freedom. We as Christians believe that God, the greatest being we could ever conceive of, gives us the freedom to accept or reject his invitation of salvation. Therefore, we believe that in economics, we should be as free as possible. Not perfectly free, but as free as possible. And so we have some guidance in Christian economics that government should be as small as possible, but as big as necessary, because we understand that we live in a fallen world. See, if it wasn't for a fallen world, we wouldn't have economics. If it wasn't for a fallen world, we wouldn't need government. We need government because humans have a fallen nature. Clearly, right now, it seems like the U.S. government is getting too big. If you look at the U.S. debt clock, which is frightening, by the way, but it says that the number one expenditure for the government is Medicare. Well, I've talked about this in podcast number 15, where I said healthcare is not a moral right, and so should the government be in healthcare. I don't have time to unpack the entire thing today. I did some of that unpacking in podcast 15. Number two, Social Security, which I've not done a podcast on, but I will someday, is a question of whether the Bible tells us. It seems to me the Bible does not tell us to be in healthcare. It seems to me the Bible does not tell us to be in Social Security. Those should be handled by churches and families. The third largest expenditure of the government is defense, which it seems to me that the government should be in. The fourth largest expenditure of the government is interest on the debt, and that certainly seems unbiblical. And I talked about that in podcast number 8. So to summarize the four biggest expenditures, it seems to me, as a Christian economist, the government should not be in three of them: healthcare, Social Security, nor paying interest on the debt. Here are some interesting ironies. I mean, in podcast 43, I got some information from a guy named Arthur Brooks in his book, Gross National Happiness. I made the point, liberals versus conservatives. Liberals are less happy than conservatives, just by definition, because conservatives want to conserve what they have. Liberals are unhappy with what they have, so they're less happy. But then the liberals want to give more power to the government, which makes them less happy. So it's a downward spiral. Isn't that an amazing irony? There's another one. This comes from a guy named Dennis Prager, and I've said it on podcasts before. Dennis Prager says, okay, so if any of your friends say to you, a pox on both their houses, I don't like Republicans, I don't like Democrats, they're all crooks. Okay, then Dennis Prager says, vote for the one who's going to do less. But we don't, do we? We vote for the one who's going to give us more. Isn't that a huge irony? So really, if you understand the fallen nature, and that's what Prager's talking about there, a friend of yours who says, all the politicians are crooks, well, then vote for the one who's the least crooked. Just kind of makes sense, but we don't do that. That's an irony. There's a third irony. Immigration. I talked about this in podcast number 37, immigration. Well, here's an irony. The people who want the government to do the most often don't want borders. Well, that doesn't make sense. Borders seems to be one of the most important functions of government. I mean, the Bible talks about having countries and having borders and having immigrants. Well, then, without a border, you don't have immigrants. President Trump was right about this. Without a border, you have no country. You can like or dislike President Trump. This is not an opinion. It's a fact. Without a border, you have no country. So isn't this a third irony? That people who want the government to do the most often want it to abandon its most important function, which is determining who enters. Oh, anyway. I'm going to give quite a few quotes today from this little book by a guy named Patrick Gary, teaches at University of South Dakota, and his book is called The False Promise of Big Government. So here's a few topics for you. Crony Capitalism. I talked about that in podcast number 40 just recently. And Gary makes this interesting point that government, the larger government gets, the more crooked it gets. Here's what he says. Yeah, this comes in terms of human freedom. Quote, human freedom will further erode when government passes even more laws. Well, he's exactly right about that. So if you want a government that is more free, if you want a country that's more free, you want a government with fewer laws. Yeah. Willie Sutton was a bank robber. This is a great quote. In his answer to a question, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. He answered two questions. Number one, why does he rob banks? And number two, why are the 4 richest counties in the United States suburbs of Washington, D.C.? I mentioned this in Crony Capitalism. Why? Because that's where the money is. Steve Forbes ran for president many series ago, 16, 20 years ago perhaps. And he had this great story about this honey pot in the forest. And his point was, look, politicians are like bears. They just can't stay away from this honey pot. So you have to starve them of their revenue. You have to give them less honey. The less honey there is, the less crony capitalism there will be. And he's exactly right. Yeah. So let's look at purpose. What's the purpose of a government? Well, the purpose of a government is to move against the fallen nature. In other words, to try to constrain the fallen nature. I've done already a couple podcasts on competition and ending discrimination. They are the best ways of controlling the fallen nature. Jonathan Gruber was a Obama economist, most famous for admitting afterwards that the passage of Obamacare is because of the stupidity of the American public. But then later on, he tried to redeem himself, and he was on Fox Business with Maria Bartiromo, and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with high taxes as long as the money gets spent well. To which I responded, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a nice Christmas. Ifs and buts are not candy and nuts. And what does he mean, if it could be spent well? Yeah. I've drawn this on the board at least 4 times already this semester, and we're only 5 weeks in. I draw a face of a human, give him a nose, give him a mouth, and then where their eyes are, I put the letter I. Got it? See the double meaning here? The eyes are substituted by the letter I's. And Jonathan Gruber could be correct. If you could find somebody who had perfect information for the left eye, perfect intent for the right eye. But Mr. Gruber, that doesn't exist in our society. It doesn't exist in humans. We're all fallen and nobody's perfect. And so his statement, there's nothing wrong with high taxes as long as it gets spent well. It can never be spent well, Mr. Gruber. What world do you live in? If you believe in the fallen nature, it can't. Nobody has perfect information and perfect intent, the two I's. Yep. Well, we like to think that government's supposed to help the poor. Here's back to Patrick Gary in his book, The False Promise of Big Government. The foundational argument underlying big government is a myth. Big government does not help the poor, the working class, nor the middle class, even though those groups provide the justification for big government. In fact, big government often hurts the supposed beneficiaries of government largesse. Those who gain the most from big government are the elite and the powerful. I refer you back to podcast number 40, Crony Capitalism. Yeah, and so I'm meeting this week in my office with some students at the university who are starting a chapter called Turning Point USA. They want a smaller government. I'm sure they're going to ask me, why are so many college professors liberal and want a bigger government? Well, simple in economics, self-interest. A high percentage of the professors work for state universities. They want to enlarge their empire. This is just too simple. But when you take somebody like me, first, I'm at a private university, so I want a smaller government. Second, I'm an economist, and economists generally do want a smaller government because they understand how this works. Third, I'm a Christian economist, which means I understand the fallen nature. So by the time you go through those three sifts, if you want to put it that way, those three strains, you'll find just about everybody at the bottom of those three does want a smaller government. But most professors want a bigger one because they work for the government. It's just too easy. Yeah. I was with some guys from Crew the other day, Campus Crusade for Christ, and we were talking about something. I thought of it later. I wish I'd have said it at the time, but I thought of it later. You know, Bill Bright designed Campus Crusade for Christ to thrive in a free market capitalist environment with a small government. Think about it. He did, didn't he? Just this last week, Joe Biden has said if he gets elected, he will raise taxes. Well, this is too simple. I mean, you can spend the money on guns or butter, as we say in economics. You can either give money to Crew, you can donate it, or you can pay it in taxes. You can't do both with the same dollar. So as taxes go up, parachurch organizations like Crew and many others will shrink. They have to. There's no way they can go up. It's just a law of economics. The money has to go somewhere. The money that's paid in taxes can't be given to parachurch organizations, nor to church organizations. Yeah. Now, we just covered in my class last week this chapter 7 on the effect of taxes. It's very clear when you draw the two-dimensional diagram. Taxes cause you to get higher priced goods and fewer of them. Now, higher price, that's not too much of a surprise. But once you take an economics course, you learn how the curves work. I mean, you find out, as Joe Biden just told us last week, if he's elected president, Americans, you will get fewer goods at higher priced. That's just the way the diagram works. I didn't make the diagram. I just draw it. And once you understand what Joe Biden just said, you understand it would be better to have a smaller government as opposed to a bigger government. Back to Patrick Gary again, the false promise of big government. Here's what he says. The progressive drive for an ever-expanding professional bureaucracy to manage that government. This bureaucracy in turn devotes itself to further expanding government and to cementing its control over that government. Thus, a mutually reinforcing circle occurs. The formation of a political class, which then contributes to bigger government, which then requires a larger political class, and so on and so forth. The bigger that government becomes, the more distant it is from the public, and the more an elite political class controls it. End quote from Patrick Gary, False Promise of Big Government. This is nature. We call it fallen nature in Christian worldview. And that's what we try to avoid by having a smaller government. Oh, just a couple notes on debt. Well, I talked about debt in my podcast number 8. Well, again, it's the number 4 in order of the federal government's expenditures. Number 4 is interest on the debt. And this is with interest rates below 1, right? Debt. You need taxes to pay off the debt. See, what people will assume is that we should raise taxes to pay off the debt. Well, that's assuming the problem is a revenue problem. They're wrong. It's not a revenue problem. Dave Ramsey says this all the time. People call him with personal income and revenue problems. He said it's very seldom a revenue problem. It's almost always an expenditure problem. And Dave Ramsey's right about this one in personal, and he's right at the government level. We don't have a revenue problem in the federal government. We have a spending problem. And anyone who suggests to you that we should raise the taxes to pay off the debt doesn't understand the fallen nature of the people you're giving that money to. They're assuming if you give them enough money, they will stop asking for more. Well, that's never happened in history. I don't doubt if you've ever turned down a raise. Have you ever said, no, that's too much? The government won't either. It's so clear. It is not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. If you don't understand that, you don't understand the fallen nature. And my last quote from Patrick Gary, The False Promise of Big Government. Quote, as the eminent philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr wrote, big central governments are inevitably immoral, since people are capable of moral good only in small communities. According to Niebuhr, human beings are too self-serving and limited in imagination to treat people outside their sphere of personal contacts with the kind of care and respect those people deserve. Patrick Gary, False Promise of Big Government. Yep. A small government is beautiful. Well, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.